The year is 1888. In the unforgiving Montana Territory, a woman's defiance could cost her more than her reputation. It could cost her her life. This is the story of Elara, a woman who dared to say no to the most powerful man in the territory, the ruthless Bartholomew Thorne. For her refusal, she wasn't just shunned. She was sentenced to a brutal public punishment meant to break her spirit. Tied by the wrists, dragged behind a galloping horse, her life was measured in inches of dust and blood. But just as the last of her hope faded, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed across the plains, a shot that would change everything. Stay with us as we uncover the incredible, true-life drama of courage, cruelty, and the lone rancher who risked it all for a stranger. The dust of Redemption Gulch was a fine red powder that settled on everything, a constant reminder of the harsh, untamed nature of the Montana Territory in 1888. It coated the rough-hewn planks of the saloon, dulled the shine on Sheriff Miller's badge, and clung to the hem of Elara's dress as she made her way down the town's single rutted street. But the dust, as pervasive as it was nothing compared to the shadow cast by Bartholomew Thorne. Thorne wasn't just a man. He was an institution in Redemption Gulch. He owned the largest cattle ranch in the valley, the Black Creek Pass, which employed half the men in town. He held the mortgage on the general store, the livery, and even the small clapboard church, where the circuit preacher held services once a month. His influence was a web, and everyone in town was caught in it one way or another. Thorne was a man of immense physical presence, tall and broad-shouldered with a thick silver-streaked beard, and eyes the color of a winter sky, cold and unyielding. He had a reputation for getting what he wanted, whether it was land cattle or the silent obedience of those around him, and for the past 6 months he had wanted Elara. Elara Hayes was a stark contrast to the ruggedness of her surroundings. With hair the color of spun gold, and eyes the vibrant blue of the wild flax that grew in the foothills, she possessed a delicate beauty that seemed out of place in the gritty town. But beneath that porcelain exterior was a core of tempered steel. Orphaned at 16 when her parents' wagon overturned during the treacherous journey west, she had learned to rely on herself. She'd taken over her father's small plot of land, a modest homestead on the edge of the valley, and with sheer grit and determination, she had made it her own. She ran a small flock of sheep, their wool prized for its softness, and tended a garden that was the envy of the town's women. She was independent, a quality Thorne found both infuriating and intoxicating. He had first made his intentions known at the town's 4th of July celebration. With the swagger of a man who had never been denied, he had cornered her near the bonfire, the flames dancing in his unblinking eyes. "Miss Hayes," he'd boomed his voice, a low rumble that commanded attention. "A woman of your qualities should not be alone. My late wife Martha has been gone 2 years now. My ranch needs a mistress. My home needs a woman's touch." It was not a proposal. It was a declaration. He spoke of her as if she were a brood mare he was considering for his stock. Elara, though intimidated by his sheer presence and the way the other townsfolk scurried out of his path, had lifted her chin. "Mr. Thorne, I am quite content with my circumstances. My home has a woman's touch my own." The crowd around them had gone silent, the air thick with unspoken tension. Thorne's face, usually set in a mask of stern control, had tightened. A flicker of something dangerous, something proprietary, had flashed in his eyes. He had forced a smile, a chilling sight that did not reach his eyes. "Spirited," he had declared to the onlookers. "I admire spirit." But Elara knew it wasn't admiration she saw. It was the look of a collector who had just found a rare butterfly, one he was determined to pin to his board. In the months that followed, Thorn's pursuit became relentless. He sent his men, led by his brutish foreman Jedediah Kane, with gifts to her homestead, a prime side of beef, a bolt of expensive fabric from a mail-order catalogue, a new saddle she had no use for. Each offering was a stone laid in the wall he was building around her. She refused them all politely but firmly, sending them back with Jedediah, whose sneering face made it clear he viewed her defiance as a personal insult. The pressure from the town was more subtle, but just as suffocating. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, would sigh dramatically when Elara came to buy supplies. "Oh, Elara, dear, you must think of your future. Thorn is a powerful man. A woman needs protection." Even Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced with gelatin, had paid her a visit, shuffling his feet and staring at the brim of his hat. "Now, Elara," he'd mumbled, "Bartholomew, Mr. Thorn, he's a pillar of this community. It ain't wise to anger him." She knew what they were all saying. Her independence was a disruption to the town's fragile ecosystem, an ecosystem that depended on Thorn's patronage and goodwill. By refusing him, she was rocking the boat, and they feared he would tip it over. The final confrontation came on a blistering August afternoon. Thorn rode up to her homestead alone, dismounting from his massive black stallion, a creature as imposing as its master. He didn't bother with the gate, instead striding directly to where she was tending her roses, the vibrant splashes of red and pink, a defiant patch of beauty against the dry brown landscape. "Elara," he said, his voice leaving no room for pleasantries. "I have been patient, more patient than I am with my own stock. I am here for your final answer. You will be my wife." She rose from her knees, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her apron. She looked him directly in the eye, her own blue gaze unwavering. "Mr. Thorn, my answer is the same as it has always been. No. I thank you for the attention, but I will not marry you." For a long moment, the only sound was the buzzing of bees in the roses and the faint bleating of her sheep. Thorn's face became a thundercloud. The civilized veneer he wore in town cracked, revealing the raw, primal arrogance beneath. "No." He repeated the word, a soft, dangerous hiss. "No one says no to me. Not the land, not the cattle, and certainly not a woman who is nothing more than a stubborn girl playing at being a homesteader." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "I will not be made a fool of, Miss Hayes. You will learn respect. You will learn your place." His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. His grip was like iron. "I am giving you one last chance to be sensible. Accept my proposal." Pain shot up her arm, but she refused to cry out. "Let go of me," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "Your proposal is an insult, and your presence here is a trespass. Leave my land." His eyes narrowed to slits. He let go of her wrist with a suddenness that made her stumble back. He looked around at her small, tidy cabin, the carefully tended garden, the neat stone fences she had built with her own hands. A cruel, contemptuous smile twisted his lips. "You are proud of this, aren't you?" he sneered, gesturing at her life's work. "This little patch of dirt. You think it makes you strong. I will show you what real strength is. I will show you and this entire pathetic town what happens when someone defies Bartholomew Thorn." He turned and strode back to his horse. As he swung himself into the saddle, he looked back at her, his face a mask of cold fury. "Tomorrow at noon," he declared, his voice ringing with the finality of a death sentence. "Tomorrow, everyone in Redemption Gulch will see you give me the respect you owe me. They will see you humbled, and then you will beg me to marry you." He spurred his horse, galloping away in a cloud of red dust, leaving Alara standing alone by her roses, the echo of his threat hanging in the oppressive heat. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was no idle threat. Bartholomew Thorn was not a man who bluffed. He intended to break her, and he intended to do it in front of the world. And in Redemption Gulch, there was no one to stop him. Sleep offered no escape for Alara. When she did manage to drift into a fitful slumber, nightmares plagued her. The thunder of hooves, the chilling glint in Thorn's eyes, the sensation of falling into an endless, dusty abyss. She awoke before dawn, the air in her small cabin thick with a sense of impending doom. The rising sun, which usually filled her with a quiet sense of purpose today, seemed to be illuminating her path to the gallows. She didn't run. The thought crossed her mind, a fleeting, desperate whisper. But where would she go? Thorn's reach extended for hundreds of miles. He had trackers and allies in every settlement. To run would be to die alone in the wilderness, hunted like an animal. More than that, a stubborn knot of defiance in her soul refused to yield. This was her home. She had poured her blood, sweat, and tears into this land. To flee would be to let Thorn win, to validate his belief that power was the only currency that mattered. If she was to be broken, it would be here on the soil she called her own. As the morning wore on, an unnatural quiet descended upon the valley. Usually she could hear the distant sounds of life from Redemption Gulch, the blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of a freight wagon. Today there was only silence, a heavy, watchful stillness that was more unnerving than any noise. She knew the town was holding its breath, waiting for the spectacle Thorn had promised. Around 10 o'clock, she saw the first riders. They gathered on the low ridge overlooking her homestead, silhouetted against the bright morning sky. They were Thorn's men, a dozen of them, including the hulking form of Jedediah Kane. They weren't advancing, just watching their presence, a promise of what was to come. Inside her cabin, Alara went through the motions of her morning routine, a small act of rebellion against the chaos threatening to engulf her. She washed her face, braided her long golden hair, and put on a simple, sturdy dress of blue calico. It was the dress she wore to work in her garden, to tend her sheep. It was the dress of the woman. She was not the victim Thorn intended to make of her. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror by the door. Her face was pale, her eyeways wider, with a fear she refused to voice, but her chin was set. Just after 11, the procession from the town began. A slow trickle of wagons and riders made their way out towards her property, creating a loose semicircle at a safe distance. She saw the Gables from the general store, their faces pale and pinched. She saw a few of the ranchers she traded wool with, their eyes avoiding her cabin. And she saw Sheriff Miller, his horse shifting nervously, the man himself looking anywhere but at the scene he was duty-bound to prevent, but utterly powerless to stop. They were all there, a reluctant audience to her humiliation. Their presence was a betrayal, but she understood it. They were trapped, just as she was, in Thorn's web. From the north, another rider approached, distinct from the townsfolk and Thorn's men. He rode a lean, muscular buckskin horse, and sat in the saddle with an easy, practiced grace. He was a stranger to her, though she might have seen him in town once or twice. He was lean himself, with the whipcord strength of a man who worked hard. A low-slung hat shadowed his face, but she could see a square jaw and a grimly set mouth. He didn't join the crowd of onlookers, but reined in his horse on a small knoll, a solitary figure watching the drama unfold. He was too far away for her to see his expression, but his stillness felt different from the nervous energy of the townsfolk. It was the stillness of a predator, patient and observant. This man was Caleb Blackwood, a rancher from the high country who kept to himself. His small ranch, the Rocking Bee, was miles away, and he rarely came into Redemption Gulch. His reasons for being there were his own, a silent mystery. As the town clock began its slow, ponderous strike of noon, Bartholomew Thorne himself appeared. He rode through the assembled crowd as if parting the Red Sea, his black stallion prancing, sensing its master's agitated state. He stopped directly in front of her gate. Jedediah Kane and 2 other men dismounted and approached her cabin. "Thorne wants you," Kane snarled, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Elara took a deep breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stepped out of her cabin, blinking in the harsh sunlight, and walked towards them. She would not be dragged out. She would walk on her own 2 feet. Her gaze swept over the crowd. She saw fear, pity, and a grim, morbid curiosity. No one met her eyes. They were complicit in their silence, and the shame was a palpable thing hanging in the air with the dust. Thorne watched her approach, a smug, triumphant look on his face. This was his theater, and the final act was about to begin. "A wise decision, Miss Hayes," he boomed so all could hear. "Perhaps you have come to your senses." She stopped before him, her small frame dwarfed by his horse. "I have come to face whatever cruelty you have devised, Mr. Thorne, but my answer remains the same." The smugness vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "So be it," he spat. He nodded to Kane. Before she could react, Kane seized her. Her arms were wrenched behind her back, and rough hemp rope was tied tightly around her wrists. The other end of the rope was thrown to another of Thorne's men, who was mounted on a skittish-looking gelding. He looped the end of the rope around his saddle horn. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was worse than they had imagined. This was a barbarism reserved for horse thieves and murderers. Sheriff Miller made a weak, half-hearted movement forward. "Now, Bartholomew," he started, "this ain't right." Thorne turned his cold gaze on the sheriff, and Miller shrank back, his words dying in his throat. "This is justice," Thorne declared. "This is what happens to those who show disrespect. She will be dragged from her proud homestead to the center of town. Perhaps the journey will give her time to reconsider my offer." He looked down at Elara, a final chilling smile on his lips. "You could have had a carriage, my dear. Instead, you chose the dust." He gave a sharp nod to the rider holding the rope. The man kicked his horse, and the gelding leaped forward. The rope went taut with a violent jerk that ripped Elara from her feet. A cry of pain was torn from her lips as her body slammed against the hard, unforgiving ground. The horse broke into a gallop, and she was dragged away from her home, from the roses she had tended, from the life she had built. Her world dissolving into a choking, terrifying cloud of red dust and searing pain. From his vantage point on the knoll, Caleb Blackwood watched his body rigid. The shadow from his hat did little to conceal the storm gathering in his eyes. His hand resting on his thigh slowly curled into a fist. He had seen brutality in his life, but this calculated public cruelty stirred something cold and dangerous within him. He watched the gap between Alara and the crowd widen, his gaze fixed on the taut rope that connected the tormentor to his victim. He had come to town for supplies, nothing more. But sometimes a man finds himself in a place he never intended to be, facing a choice he never wanted to make. And as Alara's blue dress became stained with the dirt and her own blood, Caleb knew that a choice was being forced upon him. Pain was the only reality. The world for Alara had been reduced to a brutal symphony of agony. The ground was a merciless grater, tearing at her clothes, her skin, her very being. Rock's roots and sun-baked earth ripped at her back and legs. Dust filled her nostrils, her mouth, her lungs, choking her, blinding her. The screams she tried to utter were swallowed by the dirt. The horse's hooves pounded a deafening rhythm, a drumbeat for her execution. She twisted, trying to get her feet under her, but the speed was too great. Her boots were torn from her feet, her stockings shredded in an instant. The burning friction peeled the skin from her calves and shins. Each jolt, each bounce over a rut or stone sent waves of fire through her body. Her arms, wrenched behind her, felt as if they were being torn from their sockets. The rough rope had already rubbed her wrists raw, and she could feel the slick warmth of her own blood mingling with the hemp fibers. Through the swirling red haze, she caught glimpses of the faces of her town. They were a blur of horror, fascination, and shame, a silent Greek chorus to her suffering. She saw Mrs. Gable press a handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes wide. She saw men who had once tipped their hats to her, now turning away, unable to watch, yet unable to leave. Their inaction was a sharp, stabbing betrayal that hurt almost as much as the physical torment. They were allowing this to happen. They were all Thorne's subjects. Bartholomew Thorne rode alongside the grim spectacle, his face impassive, but his eyes glowing with a dark, proprietary satisfaction. This was his power made manifest. Every scream she choked back, every foot of ground she was dragged over, was a testament to his authority. He was not just breaking a woman. He was reminding an entire town of their place. He wanted her to beg. He listened for it, his head cocked slightly, waiting for the word, the plea for mercy that would affirm his total victory. But Alara did not beg. Some primal, unyielding core within her refused to give him the satisfaction. She clenched her teeth, biting back the cries. She would not scream. She would not plead. She would give him nothing. Her consciousness began to flicker, the sharp edges of pain blurring into a dull, overwhelming roar. The world was fading to black, the pounding hooves growing distant. This is how it ends, she thought, a strange sense of detachment settling over her, dragged through the dirt like refuse. It was then that the shot rang out. It was not the familiar booming crack of a pistol. It was sharper, flatter, more powerful, the unmistakable report of a high-velocity rifle. It cut through the air, silencing the pounding of hooves, the gasps of the crowd, and the dark thoughts in Thorne's mind. For a split second, everyone froze, thinking someone had been shot. Then they saw it. The rope, which moments before had been stretched taut with Alara's full weight, had snapped. The frayed end whipped back, narrowly missing the rider's head. The horse, suddenly freed of its burden, continued for another dozen yards before its rider could pull it to a stop. Alara's body tumbled to a halt in a crumpled, motionless heap in the middle of the dusty track. Silence. A profound, ringing silence descended. All eyes turned from Alara's still form, searching for the source of the shot. They looked to the knoll where the lone rider had been watching. Caleb Blackwood sat calmly astride his buckskin, a Winchester rifle resting in the crook of his arm. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the barrel, the only evidence of his action. He hadn't moved a muscle. He just sat there, his gaze fixed not on Thorn, but on the small, broken figure lying in the dust. The spell was broken. Thorn's face, which had been a mask of triumph, contorted into a snarl of pure rage. He had been challenged, publicly. His meticulously staged drama had been interrupted by an unknown actor. "Who in the hell are you?" Thorn roared, his voice cracking with fury. He spurred his stallion towards the knoll. His men, including Jedediah Kane, quickly following suit, their hands instinctively going to their pistols. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He slowly, deliberately slid the Winchester back into its saddle scabbard. His movements were fluid, economical, devoid of any wasted motion. He seemed utterly unconcerned by the dozen armed men now riding towards him. Only when Thorn had reined in his horse a few feet away did Caleb finally lift his head, letting the full force of his cold, steady gaze fall upon the bigger man. "The name's Blackwood," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying with an unnerving clarity. "And I've seen enough." Blackwood. Thorn spat the name, searching his memory. "I don't know any Blackwood. You have no business here. You just interfered with a private matter." "That wasn't a private matter," Caleb replied, his eyes flicking for a moment to Ilara's body. "That was a public spectacle, and where I come from, we don't drag women behind horses. Not for any reason." Jedediah Kane pushed his horse forward, his face a mask of belligerent aggression. "You're a dead man stranger. You just pointed a rifle at Mr. Thorn's property." Caleb's eyes, the color of slate, shifted to Kane. There was no fear in them, only a chilling emptiness that made the brutish foreman pause. "The rope was the only thing I was pointing at. It was a clean shot, but if you want to make this uglier, I'm game. My next shot might not be so precise." The sheer audacity of the man was stunning. He was one man against a dozen, yet he spoke as if he held all the cards. The townspeople watched, mesmerized, their fear momentarily forgotten in the face of this raw, unexpected confrontation. Thorn stared at Caleb, a new calculating light entering his eyes. This wasn't some drunken cowhand. The way he held himself, the confidence in his voice, the lethal efficiency with which he had handled that rifle. This was a man to be reckoned with. But Thorn's authority had been flouted. He could not back down. "You've made a grave mistake, Blackwood," Thorn said, his voice low and menacing. "You've chosen the wrong side. That woman defied me. She defied the natural order of things. She needed a lesson." "Looks to me like the lesson's over," Caleb said, and without another word, he nudged his buckskin forward, riding not away from Thorn, but directly past him towards the center of the track. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, his back to Thorn and his men, a gesture of either supreme confidence or utter foolishness. He knelt beside Ilara's still form. He gently reached out and turned her over. Her face was a mess of scrapes and blood, her beautiful golden hair matted with dirt. Her dress was in tatters, revealing the raw, bleeding flesh of her back and legs. But she was breathing. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged gasps. A wave of fury, cold and pure, washed over Caleb. He looked at the rope burns on her wrists, at the state of her. He had seen the results of bar fights, stampedes and gunfights. But the calculated cruelty inflicted on this woman struck a deeper, more resonant chord of rage. He looked up over his shoulder, his eyes meeting Thorn's across the dusty ground. "You're done with her," he said, and it was not a request. It was a statement of fact. "She's with me now." The air in the valley crackled with a tension so thick it felt like a physical force. Thorn's men had their hands on their guns, their knuckles white. The townspeople were frozen, a gallery of statues witnessing a scene they could scarcely comprehend. For the first time in as long as anyone could remember, Bartholomew Thorn had been told no by a man with a gun, and that man was now claiming the very person Thorn had sought to make an example of. Thorn's face was a mottled canvas of purple and red. The veins on his temple throbbed. To be defied by a slip of a girl was one thing. To be challenged by a complete stranger in front of the entire town was an intolerable insult to his sovereignty. "You're not taking anyone anywhere, Blackwood." Thorn snarled, his voice a low growl of thunder. "She is my affair. This is my town." Caleb didn't even bother to stand up. He remained kneeling beside Alara, his presence a shield between her and the world. He carefully began to unbutton his canvas duster. "Your town." He mused, his voice deceptively calm as he shrugged out of the heavy coat. "Funny. I didn't see your name on the map." He gently, almost reverently, draped the duster over Alara's torn and bloodied body, covering her from the prying, horrified eyes of the onlookers. "Cain," Thorn barked, his patience finally snapping. "Remind this drifter of the laws of hospitality in Redemption Gulch." But Jedediah Cain needed no further encouragement. A vicious grin spread across his face as he drew his Colt Peacemaker. "With pleasure, boss." But as Cain's pistol cleared its holster, Caleb moved. He wasn't fast like a gunslinger in a dime novel. He was efficient, a blur of pure economy. In the same motion as he covered Alara his own pistol, a well-worn Colt that had clearly seen its share of use was in his hand. He didn't stand and face them. He remained on one knee, a low, stable, and deadly target, his gun leveled not at Cain, but directly at the center of Bartholomew Thorn's chest. Cain froze his own gun aimed at Caleb. The other men hesitated, their eyes darting between their boss, the defiant stranger, and Cain. It was a classic standoff, but with a fatal imbalance. Caleb had the drop on the most important man there. "Your man is fast, Thorn," Caleb said, his voice as cold as a mountain stream. "But he's not faster than this bullet. You want to trade your life for mine? Go ahead, pull the trigger, Cain. But your boss dies before I hit the ground. Is this woman worth that much to you?" The silence stretched thin and brittle. Every man there knew that Caleb Blackwood was not bluffing. The look in his eyes was one of utter commitment. He had made his calculation and was prepared to see it through. Thorn stared down the barrel of Caleb's Colt. He saw his own mortality reflected in that small, dark hole. For all his wealth, his land, his power over men, he was just as vulnerable to a piece of lead as anyone else. And this man, this Blackwood, looked like he wouldn't hesitate. Slowly, deliberately, Thorn raised a hand. "Hold, Jedediah." Cain looked at his boss, his face a mask of confusion and frustration. "But boss!" "I said hold," Thorn roared. Grudgingly, Cain lowered his pistol, though he kept it in his hand. Thorn's gaze never left Caleb. "You have made a powerful enemy today, Blackwood. There is no corner of this territory where you can hide from me." "Wasn't planning on hiding," Caleb replied, his own gun remaining steady. "Now I'm going to take the lady, and I'm going to leave. Your men will stay right where they are until I'm over that ridge. If so much as one of them spits in my direction, I'll take that as a sign of ill intent. We clear." Without waiting for an answer, Caleb holstered his pistol. It was a move of incredible risk, a calculated gamble that Thorn valued his own life more than his pride. He then slid his arms carefully under Elara's battered body, cradling her against his chest. As he stood, she let out a low moan, her head lolling against his shoulder. Her consciousness was flickering, but she was alive. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace towards his buckskin horse. The animal stood placidly unfazed by the tension. With a strength that surprised the onlookers, Caleb lifted Elara and settled her in the saddle. Sitting her sideways before mounting behind her, his arms securely around her to hold her in place. He cast one last look at the assembled crowd. His eyes met Sheriff Miller's for a brief, contemptuous moment, then swept over the townsfolk a silent indictment of their collective cowardice. Finally, his gaze settled on Thorn. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture not of respect, but of acknowledgement. A promise. Then he turned the buckskin and urged it into a slow walk, heading north away from the town towards the rugged high country. Thorn watched him go, his face a granite mask of fury. The humiliation burned in his gut like acid. He had been beaten outmaneuvered and made to look weak, and it had all happened in front of everyone. "Find out who he is," he hissed to Kane, his voice barely a whisper. "Find out where he lives. I want to know everything. I want the name of his horse. I want to know if he snores. And then we will pay Mr. Blackwood a visit. We will retrieve my property and teach him a lesson about meddling that he will never, ever forget." The ride was a blur of pain for Elara. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the steady strength of the arms around her, the rhythmic movement of the horse, and the unfamiliar scent of sage leather, and the man who held her. Each jolt sent fresh waves of agony through her, but there was a strange security in his embrace. He was a solid living wall between her and the horror she had just endured. It was late afternoon when they finally stopped. The air was cooler here, thinner with the scent of pine. She opened her eyes, blinking against the light. They were in a small hidden valley, a bowl of green grass and wildflowers, surrounded by towering walls of grey stone. A log cabin, sturdier and larger than her own, sat nestled against the rock-face smoke, curling lazily from its stone chimney. A well-built corral held 2 other horses, and a small stream gurgled nearby. It was a place of profound peace and isolation. It was a fortress. Caleb dismounted carefully, lifting her down from the horse as if she were made of glass. He carried her inside the cabin. The interior was Spartan but clean and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A handmade table and chairs sat in the center. Shelves filled with books lined another wall, an unexpected sight. In the corner was a bed with a simple quilt. He laid her gently on the bed face down and began the difficult process of tending to her wounds. He moved with a quiet, practiced competence, his large hands surprisingly gentle. He fetched water from the stream and with a soft cloth began to clean the dirt and gravel from the dozens of cuts and abrasions on her back and legs. Elara flinched and cried out as the cloth touched her raw skin. But she didn't fight him. My dress," she managed to whisper, the shame of her tattered clothes returning. "It's ruined," he said, simply, his voice gruff but not unkind. With a small sharp knife, He carefully cut away the shredded fabric of the blue calico, leaving her in her chemise. He worked in silence, his expression grim. He applied a foul-smelling but soothing salve to her wounds from a small tin. "What is your name?" she whispered, her cheek pressed against the cool fabric of the quilt. "Caleb." He answered his focus entirely on his task. "Why?" she asked, the question encompassing everything. "Why did you shoot the rope? Why did you face Thorn? Why did you bring me here?" He paused for a moment, his hand hovering over a particularly nasty gash on her shoulder. He looked not at her but at the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall, as if seeing something far away. "Because I've seen men like Thorn before," he said, his voice low and laced with a bitterness that seemed ancient. "I've seen what happens when people are too scared to stand up to them. I made a promise to myself a long time ago that I wouldn't be one of them. Not again." He finished his work, pulling a clean sheet up to cover her. He moved to the fireplace and began to build up the fire, the setting sun casting long shadows into the quiet room. Elara watched him, this stranger, who had appeared out of nowhere and thrown himself into the path of her destruction. He was a man of contradictions, a gentle nurse and a deadly gunman, a recluse with a library. She was safe for now. But as the firelight flickered, casting his craggy profile into sharp relief, she knew with a chilling certainty that he had not saved her from the storm. He had only pulled her into its eye, and Bartholomew Thorn was the kind of storm that never blew itself out. The first few days at Caleb's ranch were a fever dream of pain and healing. Elara drifted in a state of semi-consciousness, her body fighting a war against infection and agony. Caleb was a constant, quiet presence. He fed her broth, changed her bandages with a steady hand, and kept the fire roaring to ward off the chill of the high country nights. He rarely spoke, but his actions spoke volumes. He was a man accustomed to solitude, yet he cared for her with a devotion that was both baffling and deeply comforting. Slowly the fog in her mind began to clear, and with it came a dawning awareness of her strange new reality. She learned the rhythms of his life. He was up before the sun tending to his horses and the small herd of cattle that grazed in the hidden valley. He spent his days mending fences, chopping wood, and working with a silent, relentless energy. In the evenings he would sit by the fire and read from one of his many books, Shakespeare, Plutarch, works of philosophy. It was a profound contrast to the barely literate cowhands and ranchers she had known her whole life. As her strength returned, she began to move around the small cabin, wincing with every step. She saw the details of his life, the single chipped cup he drank his coffee from the worn leather of his saddlebags, the way he meticulously cleaned his rifle every evening. His life was one of discipline and self-containment. "You never told me why you have so many books," she said one evening, her voice still raspy. She was sitting propped up in a chair, wrapped in a blanket, watching him by the firelight. He looked up from his book, his face unreadable in the flickering shadows. "My father was a teacher, back east. He believed a man could build a fortress with books as strong as any made of stone." "Is that what this is?" she asked softly. "Your fortress?" He closed the book, his gaze turning inward. "It was supposed to be." He looked at her then, and for the first time she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his guarded eyes. Men like Thorn, they don't respect fortresses. They only see things they want to conquer. The peace was shattered a week after her arrival. Caleb was out checking his fence lines when he saw them a plume of dust rising from the pass that was the only entrance to his valley. It wasn't a single rider. It was a group. He didn't need a spyglass to know who it was. Thorn had found him. He spurred his buckskin back to the cabin, his face a grim mask. "They're here," he said as he burst through the door. "At least 10 of them." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in Elara's stomach. "What are we going to do?" Caleb was already moving, his actions precise and purposeful. He pulled his Winchester from its scabbard and grabbed 2 extra boxes of cartridges from a wooden chest. He strapped on his gun belt. "You're going to stay inside, away from the door and the window," he commanded. He grabbed a second rifle, a heavy caliber Sharps from its pegs on the wall. "I built this place for a reason. The cabin is solid log and the back wall is the mountain itself. They can't get behind us. They have to come from the front." He looked at her, his eyes intense. "No matter what you hear, you do not come out. Understood?" She could only nod, her throat tight with fear. He went outside, and she watched through a small crack in the window shutter as he took up a position behind a low wall of rocks he had built for just this purpose. It gave him a clear view of the mouth of the valley. Thorn and his men rode into the valley, fanning out in a semicircle just out of effective pistol range. Thorn on his black stallion was at the center, with Jedediah Kane beside him. "Blackwood?" Thorn's voice boomed, echoing off the stone walls of the valley. "I've come for what is mine. Send out the girl, and I might let you live." Caleb's reply was not verbal. He raised the Sharps rifle, took careful aim, and fired. The shot was a deafening roar in the enclosed space. The bullet didn't hit a man. It slammed into the ground, just in front of Thorn's stallion. The horse reared violently, nearly unseating its powerful rider. It was a message, a line drawn in the dirt. "That's my only warning, Thorn!" Caleb shouted back, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "The next one won't be aimed so low. This is my land. Get off it!" Kane, enraged, raised his own rifle. "Let's take him, boss. He's just one man." But Thorn, having regained control of his horse, was more cautious. He had seen Caleb's marksmanship. This valley was a natural kill box. To charge in would be suicide. "Spread out," he ordered his men. "Find cover, we'll starve him out." The siege began. For days they were trapped. Thorn's men took pot shots at the cabin, their bullets thudding into the thick logs. Caleb returned fire sparingly, only when one of the men got too bold. His shots always precise, always driving them back into cover. He was a masterful tactician, using the terrain to his advantage, making one man seem like 5. Inside the cabin, Elara felt a suffocating sense of guilt. This was her fault. This man, this stranger, was risking his life for her. During the long, tense hours, she did what she could. She reloaded the spare rifle, she made sure he had water, and she watched his back from the window, her heart pounding with every distant gunshot. On the 3rd night of the siege, as they sat in the darkness, a single lantern providing a small pool of light, she finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Caleb, there's more to this, isn't there, between you and Thorn? You said you'd seen men like him before." Caleb was silent for a long time, staring into the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of memory. "My name wasn't always Blackwood. It was Callan. Caleb Callan. My family had a ranch in the Wyoming territory. Not as big as Thorn's, but it was good land. We were there first." He paused, the muscle in his jaw tightening. "Then he came. His name was Bartholomew Thorn back then, too. He wanted our water rights. He tried to buy us out. My father, he was a proud man, a stubborn man. He said no, just like you did." Elara listened, her blood running cold. Thorn started a campaign. Caleb continued, his voice barely a whisper. He rustled our cattle. He poisoned a well. He turned the whole town against us with lies and threats, just like he did to you. Sheriff did nothing. It all came to a head one night. He and his men, they rode in. They said my father had pulled a gun on them. It was a lie. They burned our house. My mother, my sister, they were trapped inside. He stopped, unable to continue, the raw pain of the memory silencing him. My father and I were out on the range. He finally went on, his voice hollow. We saw the glow in the sky. By the time we got there, it was too late. Thorn's men were waiting. They shot my father down in the yard. I was just a boy, 16 years old. I was shot in the side, left for dead. I managed to crawl away into the night. I heard them laughing. Elara felt tears stream down her face for the boy he had been and the man he had become. All his solitude, his books, his hardness, it was all a shell built around an old, gaping wound. I changed my name. I drifted for years. Worked as a ranch hand, a scout, even a lawman for a time. But I could never outrun it. I finally saved enough to buy this place somewhere quiet, somewhere I thought the world couldn't touch me. I just wanted to be left alone. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a terrible, weary sadness. And then I rode into Redemption Gulch for a bag of flour, and I saw his face. I saw him doing it all over again to you, and I knew I couldn't just stand by. Not again. The confession hung in the air between them, a shared ghost. She now understood everything. This wasn't just about saving her. This was about him saving the boy who had failed to save his own family. It was his chance at redemption. She reached out and placed her hand on his. His skin was rough, calloused, but his hand was steady. You are not alone in this fight, Caleb, she said, her voice filled with a strength she didn't know she possessed. He took your family. He tried to take my life. We will face him together. In that moment, in that besieged cabin, surrounded by enemies, something shifted between them. It wasn't just about a rescuer and a victim anymore. It was a bond forged in shared pain and a mutual burning desire for justice. The siege of Rocking Bee was not the end. It was the beginning of the reckoning. The siege tightened its grip, turning the valley into a pressure cooker. Days bled into nights, marked only by the dwindling pile of cartridges and the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. The constant threat wore them down, but it also crystallized their resolve. Elara, no longer the fragile woman who had been dragged through the dust, became a partner in their defense. She learned the weight and kick of the Sharp's rifle, her eyes scanning the valley with a vigilance that matched Caleb's. They were a two-person army, and they both knew that their time was running out. He's waiting for us to starve or make a mistake, Caleb said grimly. His eye pressed to the spyglass as dawn broke on their 9th day of confinement. Then we'll do something he doesn't expect. Elara replied, her voice steady. A desperate, daring plan had taken root in her mind. He thinks he has us pinned down in here. He's focused on you. He has forgotten about me. That night, under a sliver of moon, they put her audacious plan into motion. Caleb began a volley of fire toward Thorn's camp, a calculated risk with their dwindling ammunition. The shots drew the attackers' attention, pinning them down and creating the diversion Elara needed. While the valley echoed with gunfire, Elara, dressed in dark clothes, slipped out the back of the cabin. She was a shadow against the stone, scrambling up a treacherous game trail that scaled the cliff face. Her bare feet found holds in the rock as she climbed a pouch with oil-soaked rags and matches clutched in her hand. Her target was the one thing that gave Thorn's men their advantage, their horses tethered carelessly at the rear of the camp. Reaching a ledge overlooking the makeshift corral, she worked with trembling hands. She lit a rag, the small flame a defiant spark in the vast darkness, and dropped it into a pile of dry brush below. The fire caught with an explosive whoosh. Flames roared to life, and the horses, terrified by the sudden light and smell of smoke, went mad. They screamed and tore at their tethers, their panic turning into a full-blown stampede. The chaos in Thorn's camp was absolute. Shouts of confusion rang out as his men were caught between Caleb's gunfire from the front and the inferno at their backs. Horses thundered through the camp, trampling everything in their path. Thorn's siege and his control had just been broken by the very woman he had sought to humiliate. Enraged, realizing he'd been outmaneuvered, Thorn saw his victory slipping away. "He's making a break for it," he roared, grabbing a rifle. Abandoning all caution, he charged on foot toward Caleb's position with the ever-loyal Jedediah Kane and a handful of men at his heels. But Caleb wasn't running. He was waiting. As Thorn's desperate charge brought him into the open, Caleb rose from behind his rock wall, his Colt steady in his hand. At the same moment, Elara appeared at the cabin window, the heavy Sharps rifle leveled and ready. They were no longer targets. They were a firing line. "It's over, Thorn." Caleb's voice cut through the chaos. "You've lost." Thorn froze his chest, heaving his face a mask of disbelief. He looked from Caleb to Elara, seeing not a broken victim, but a warrior, her eyes blazing with cold fire in the light of the flames. Before he could react, another voice boomed from the valley entrance. "Drop your weapons, U.S. Marshal's office!" A dozen armed men, led by a tall lawman with a silver star, appeared at the mouth of the valley, blocking the only escape. Sheriff Miller, looking deeply ashamed, stood with them. Thorn was trapped. But Jedediah Kane, blinded by fury and loyalty, made one last fatal mistake. With a guttural roar, he raised his pistol to fire at Caleb. 2 shots rang out, as one from Caleb's Colt and Elara's Sharps. Kane was thrown from his feet, his life ending in the dust. The finality of it broke Thorn. He stared at the lawmen before him, and the 2 resolute figures who had defied him. The power he had wielded for so long had vanished. With a look of utter defeat, he let his rifle clatter to the ground. As the sun rose, casting a clean light over the valley, the law took Thorn and his men into custody. Caleb and Elara stood together, watching the procession leave. The long fight was finished. The burning hatred that had driven Caleb for years had finally cooled, replaced by a quiet peace. "What will you do now?" he asked softly. Elara looked at her own distant homestead, and then back at the man who had saved her, the man for whom she had fought. "My home. I think it's here now," she said, her voice clear and strong. "If you'll have me." Caleb looked at his cabin, which had once been a fortress of solitude, but now felt like a home. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "It was always missing something," he said, a slow smile chasing away the last of the shadows. "I think it was you." Together they turned and walked back to the cabin survivors who had faced down a tyrant and found in the ashes of their past a shared future. The story of Elara Hayes and Caleb Blackwood is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't found in cruelty or domination, but in the courage to stand for what is right, even when you stand alone. Their ordeal in the Montana Territory was not just a fight for survival. It was a battle for the soul of a community, proving that the will of one defiant woman and one determined man could topple an empire built on fear. They faced the worst of humanity, and in doing so, found the best in each other. These are the kinds of stories from the Wild West that often go untold. If their incredible journey from the depths of despair to hard-won peace moved you, please give this video a like to help share their legacy. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the forgotten heroes and hidden dramas of the American frontier. Share this video with someone who loves a story of true grit, and let us know in the comments which part of Elara and Caleb's story resonated with you the most. Thank you for watching.